Eye of the Beholder by Ruth Nordin, Chapter 8. 5 days later, Dave was ready to clean the stalls after breakfast when someone called out his name. "Dave, are you in there?" Recognizing his brother's anxious voice, Dave set the rake down and came out of the building, lowering the top part of his hat so the sun wouldn't get in his eyes. "What's wrong, Tom?" His 25-year-old brother looked relieved when he saw him. "Neil's cattle escaped sometime early this morning and are headed to town. We need to get them rounded up and back home. Can you help?" "Sure, I'll be there soon." "All right, the cattle were last spotted on the corner of Zachary Phillips and Jimmy Parsons' properties." "I'll be there." As Tom rode off, Dave went into the house where Mary cut up apples to set in the freshly made crust for another one of her delicious pies. His mouth watered just thinking about it. She paused, her knife halfway down a red apple, and glanced at him. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "Neil's cattle broke free of his fence sometime early this morning. I have to go help bring them back. I don't know how long I'll be. It sounds like a group of us farmers will be there. Hopefully, I'll be back by mid-afternoon." He placed his hand on the small of her back and gave her cheek a warm kiss, noting the sweet scent of lilac soap in her hair. "I can clean the stalls after I milk the cow. I want to get this pie in the oven first." She finished cutting the apple in front of her. "Isn't it just like you to pitch in and help at a moment's notice?" His heart swelled with pride. "You really are a special woman, Mary. I'm lucky that I found you when I did." She blushed at his words. Giving her another kiss, he headed for the barn, where he gathered the necessary items to saddle Jack. He was ready to get on the horse when he remembered to get the lasso. It didn't take him long to catch up to the older men, who were rounding up cattle to turn them back to the Craftsman farm. Neil, Tom, and Jimmy chased after their respective cattle. Joel arrived on the downward slope of Jimmy's property. Dave waved him over, noticing his brother looked as if he'd just thrown on some clothes, since they didn't even match. "How did Neil's cattle escape?" Joel asked, riding over to him. "I don't know. I just got here." "Well," Joel began, "I think there's 20 cattle altogether. Neil was bragging on them the other day, so I remember the number." Dave nodded. "Let's get to work." A quick assessment told him how many cattle the three men had under control, so when he spotted one that was furthest away from the group, he prompted Jack to chase it down. The activity took more time than Dave anticipated. He lassoed 2 cattle that resisted going with the rest of the group, which several of them seemed to do every 10 or 15 minutes. He was relieved when they finally put them all into the fenced area. He took his hat off and wiped the sweat from his brow. The early afternoon sunny weather didn't feel oppressively hot that day, but exerting all that energy on the cattle wore him out. "I'm sure you're hungry," Neil said as he walked over to the 4 men as they leaned against the gate. "Would you like to grab a bite before you go back home? It's the least I could do to thank you for your help." The 3 men agreed, and as anxious as Dave was to return to Mary, his growling stomach insisted he stay. They washed up at the well in Neil's front yard, which stood a quarter mile from the sod house, while Neil went to tell his wife to get something ready for the men to eat. "Since when did Neil get a well?" Tom asked as he brought up a bucket of fresh, cool water that felt like heaven on earth to Dave's hot face. "I think it was a couple of months ago," Jimmy, the middle-aged farmer, said. "He said he was tired of running around the river all the time to get water." "The river isn't that far," Dave replied. Jimmy shrugged. "Maybe he did it because he figured it was time to place an ad for a wife. A woman from back east likes to have water close by." "He got married?" Tom didn't hide his shock. "If you went to church last Sunday, you would have heard the announcement," Jimmy replied. Neil didn't attend their church, so Dave didn't find out about it until after the fact, since Neil married earlier that morning after the 8 a.m. service. "My girls were sick, and between the 2 of them, it took a full 2 weeks for them to recover," Tom explained. "I had to stay and help Jessica. A stressed-out, expectant woman is no fun to be around." "I can't believe Neil got married," Joel spoke up. Jimmy nodded. "I was as taken aback as you are. He ran around with so many women that it didn't seem like he would ever settle down. You can't help but feel sorry for her." "Why do you say that?" Joel asked. Jimmy took a moment to consider his words. "I've never been too impressed with him." "Because he sleeps around?" "No, because I'm sick and tired of having to come to his aid when he neglects his duties. This isn't the first time I've had to chase down cattle for him. I only do it to keep them away from my herd. His cattle are inferior in quality. I'd hate to breed my stock with his. Out of the corner of his eye, Dave caught sight of one of the cattle sauntering off the property. He must have a rip in his fence. Look over there. Tom and Joel groaned while Jimmy shook his head and muttered something about lazy people. Jimmy hopped up on his horse and immediately brought the bull back, while the other men rushed over to the torn section of the fence to prevent any more cattle from escaping. "This is going to take Neil all day to fix," Tom commented. "If he does a good job," Dave remarked. Jimmy sighed. "All right. This needs repairing right away. Can I have help with this?" The three men agreed since no one wanted to lose another full day's work running after Neil's cattle. Jimmy went to the sod house to talk to Neil. "You know," Tom began, "if we refuse to chase the cattle in the future, it might force Neil to take better care of his property." "Cattle running through town might cause a lot of damage," Dave reflected. "That's if they even head in that direction. They might wind up on my property. Then I'd have to deal with them anyway." "Lucky for me, I'm on the other side of you," Tom said. "This is exactly why I plant crops," Dave replied. "It can be a lot of work while planting and harvesting, but for the rest of the time you pretty much just watch it grow." "Dave," Joel leaned forward, "I heard you got married." "I did," Dave said. "She's a great girl." "Is she pretty?" "I think so." "Of course. If you had gone to church, you would have seen her." "My horse fell in a ditch last Sunday." Tom grinned and patted Dave on the back. "You finally took my advice and posted an ad for a wife?" "I met her from an answered ad," Dave replied. Granted, it was Neil's ad, but it was as close to the truth as he would tell them. "What's her name?" Tom asked. "Jenny said her name is Mary," Joel told Tom. "Haven't you gone to visit Sally or Jenny?" "Where have you been? I already said my girls were sick," Tom explained. "I don't have a lot of time to leave for town." Glancing at Dave, he asked, "Where's Mary from?" "Maine," Joel inserted. "I haven't lost my voice," Dave joked. Joel grinned. "I can't let you hog all the attention." Tom looked over at Dave. "So when are we going to meet her?" Dave stared at Joel to see if he would jump in again. Joel, looking startled, asked, "How would I know? I can't read your mind." "Just making sure it's safe to answer," Dave smiled. "I'll bring her to Pa and Ma's when we build the barn. You'll meet her next week, unless you can make it to church this Sunday." "Good for you, Dave," Tom said. "It's too bad I didn't know, or I would have said hi when I was over at your place this morning." At that moment, Jimmy returned. "All right, Neil has some barbed wire in his shed. I'll gather what we need and we can fix this." "Where is Neil?" Dave asked. "He's helping his new wife cook." He chuckled and shook his head. "I have a feeling he's using that as an excuse to be with her. I got a chance to see her, and she's a looker." "Really?" Joel grunted. "Maybe I should advertise for a wife when I turn 18. Apparently there's a good selection of women from back east." As they worked on the fence, their conversation ranged from how their farms fared to Jimmy and Tom giving Dave advice on marriage. Just as they completed the repair, Neil appeared. "I didn't expect you to do this, but I appreciate it. Are you ready to eat?" Dave's insistent growling stomach urged him to follow the men to the house. "We'll have to eat out here, since there's not room for all of us in the house," Neil explained. Dave sat between Joel and Tom on the grass. Jimmy plopped down next to Tom. Dave deeply inhaled, but stopped when he realized he smelled manure. He was used to that smell in the sod barn, but not outside of it. Outside of it, the sweet smell of growing clover and fresh air filled his nostrils on his property. Neil sat between Jimmy and Joel. They formed a circle, making Neil in direct line of Dave's vision. Dave forced aside the urge to call the man out on his rude behavior towards Mary. If it hadn't been for the fact that he wished to save Mary from others knowing what had transpired at the train station between her and Neil, he would have let Neil have it. She didn't deserve the way Neil treated her, and having gotten to know her as well as he did, Dave was grateful she ended up with him instead. "I'll be building a wooden house in that direction, so Cassie doesn't have to be so close to the animals," Neil informed the group. "Maybe you should expand your fence so your cattle will have more room to roam while you're making improvements," Jimmy suggested. That's not a bad idea, Neil agreed. Do you have money for all of that? Tom wondered. I mean, you just put in the well and purchased some cattle. The lumber for building this house won't be cheap either. Even Jessica and I are staying in our sod house because it's inexpensive, though we have 2 children and one on the way. I've managed to save aside a nice amount of money over the past decade, Neil replied. Looking up and over Dave's head, he widely smiled. There's my beautiful bride. Dave glanced at Cassie, blinking in surprise at her dress. The pink lace and ruffles were superfluous, and the delicate material would not last long. Her long black hair was swept back with a pink bow, so her curls framed her pretty face. She was in for a rude awakening when she realized that her clothes and hairstyle had no place on the farm. Yes, she was pretty. No one could deny that. But she was too thin, and she didn't have the curves that Dave had become accustomed to touching. I hope you like ham and potatoes and carrots, she said in a sing-song voice. I know I do, Joel enthusiastically nodded as he accepted his plate. She handed the other plate to Neil. I'll be back with more plates. After she slipped into the house, Joel whistled. Neil, you lucky dog. How did you manage to marry her? I told you she was good-looking, Jimmy inserted. Good-looking? She's every man's dream come true, Joel said. She's a pretty one, all right, Tom admitted, though I wouldn't put her above Jessica. A man has to be loyal to his wife, Jimmy winked at Tom. Neil's face glowed at their appreciation of his wife's beauty. She's a gem, all right. Cassie returned with plates for Dave, Tom, and Jimmy. I'll be back with the coffee. Where did she come from? Neil wondered. Pennsylvania, Neil replied. I'll have to advertise specifically in that state when I ask for a wife, Joel decided. Dave sighed and took a bite of his mashed potatoes. He fought the urge to spit the grainy and soupy slop out. He quickly glanced at the other men, who also hesitated after taking their first bite. Neil gave an embarrassed smile. Mrs. Brown is teaching her how to cook. She never made anything before she came out here. Jimmy gave a slight grimace as he swallowed his food. Good, because there's more to a woman than her looks. She'll get better, Neil insisted. It's just a matter of learning what to do. I didn't mean anything bad by it. I'm sure she'll get better with time. Who cares how she cooks? Joel laughed. She's worth coming home to every night. Can you imagine how great Neil's nights are? Spoken like a 17-year-old, Jimmy mused. Turning to the young man, he pointed a fork in his direction. There's more to marriage than lovemaking, though I admit a good intimate life helps. Tom chuckled. You're a walking contradiction. No, I'm not. I've been married to Doris for 26 years, and I've learned some things about maintaining a happy marriage. Cassie returned with cups of coffee for Neil, Joel, and Jimmy. Could I have water instead, please? Dave asked her. If her cooking was an indicator of the coffee, he wanted to skip that experience. As it was, he barely managed to swallow the rubbery carrots and extremely salty ham. She nodded and returned to the house. Dave, why are you so quiet? Tom wondered. Usually we can't get you to shut up. I'm tired, Dave blandly replied. Mary keeping you up all night? Tom grinned. I remember when I was first married. I couldn't get enough of Jessica. Neil snorted under his breath and shook his head. Dave's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what Neil was thinking, and he didn't like it. His protective instinct kicked into high gear, and as much as he wanted to warn Neil to stop insulting Mary, he couldn't do it without hurting her. I'm going home, Dave said. Mary helped Sally and Jenny win the cooking contest last week, and I'm in the mood for some great-tasting food. He forced his hands to gently set the plate on the grass, so he wouldn't fling it in Neil's direction. Then he jumped up. The other men looked stunned, while Neil frowned at him. Don't mess with me, Neil, he thought. He hoped the man read his expression loud and clear. As he turned to go to his horse, he nearly bumped into Cassie. Do you want the water? She asked, raising the glass to him. You poor woman, Dave thought. You're married to a snake and you don't even know it. No, thank you, ma'am, he said aloud. I need to get home. He tipped his hat to her and left without a backward glance. By the time Dave returned home, he found Mary laying out grain from the previous year to feed the horses and cow. The foal and mare looked very happy to stand side by side and eat from the same trough. As soon as Jack neighed, as he rode into the barn, she turned her attention to him. The sight of her welcoming smile warmed his heart. He slid off his horse. He didn't realize how tired he was until he saw her concerned expression. The evening sun began to spread its brilliant pink and orange hues across the sky. Between chasing cattle, fixing a fence, and fighting the urge to tell Neil exactly what he thought of him, he had gone through a rough day. "Are you hungry?" she asked him as she walked over to him. "I can fix something right after I get Jack settled and fed." Dave didn't care what Neil said or thought. Mary was the kind of woman a man was very happy to come home to. He took her in his arms and kissed her, taking in the sweet smell of cinnamon apple pie she had made earlier that day. Her flesh was soft, her curves molding into his body. She was altogether wonderful. He reluctantly ended the kiss, but continued to hold her tightly to him. "Was your day that trying?" She tried to sound playful, but he noted her sympathy. "Let's just say I'm glad it's over." He took a good look around the barn and saw that she had taken care of the animals. In the corner of the barn, he noticed a bucket of dead bugs that she had pried off the corn in the field. And then he realized she was wearing pants. "Did you do all of the chores?" She shrugged. "I had plenty of time after I finished baking. There are only so many pies a woman could make before she needs something else to do. Why don't you go to the river and take your bath? I'll take care of Jack and get supper ready. Then you can go to bed." Despite the temptation to take her to bed right then, his aching body and growling stomach pressed him to take her advice. Once he cleaned up, he enjoyed her delicious food, which somehow tasted better than before. As he stood up from the table, she offered to rub his back and arms to ease his sore muscles. He gratefully accepted and proceeded to make love to her, taking his time to fully appreciate her. Neil had it wrong. Love-making with Mary was the most pleasurable experience Dave had ever had, and he slept even better since he held her close to him through the night. 2 days before they were due to go to his parents' farm, Dave took Mary to town so she could collect a couple of items from the mercantile and check for a letter from her parents at the post office. She shrieked with delight when she saw that they had written to her. While he went to take care of his wagon, she stayed inside the small post office. She ripped the envelope open and held the letter up to the window for better lighting. Her enthusiasm faltered as she read through the contents of the note. "We were relieved to hear that the marriage plans worked out and that your husband is a good man. We've given it considerable thought and decided you showed wise judgment when you answered that ad after all. Thankfully, decent men are in desperate need of women out there. We worried for you here since we couldn't find someone to court you because you weren't as pretty as your sisters. Now that's all in the past, and you can realize your dream of having children." Mary's hands trembled as she debated whether or not to finish the missive. She understood that her family believed that she would never marry because of her looks. So why did the word sting? She should be used to it. She should have expected it. And yet, it no longer seemed fair that they should compare her to her sisters. Looking out the window of the post office, she spied Dave laughing and talking to a man she didn't recognize. Did he regret marrying her? She didn't fool herself into thinking that he would have married her if given the chance to marry someone more pleasing to look at. She wondered how he could act as if he enjoyed being stuck with her. He should have sent a real ad to the paper. Did he ever wish he had? She didn't know. And she decided that she didn't want to know. Preferring the fantasy that he honestly found her pleasant, rather than a necessity on his farm, she took a deep breath and read the rest of the note, biting her lower lip to prepare herself for whatever else her family chose to write. Fortunately, the rest of it was full of updates regarding the people they knew. It ended with wishes of happiness. "Not love," she noted, glancing at her good-looking husband. The most she could ever hope for was that he would be content with her. Brushing back some tears, she ripped the paper and threw the pieces into the trash can by her feet. She didn't care to be reminded of it. Her moving to Nebraska might have been the best thing she ever did for herself. "Are you ready to go?" Dave's voice startled her. Aware that he stood behind her, she wiped her tears away, waiting until her emotions settled before turning to him. Yes, I'm ready. She strode to the door he held open for her, purposely avoiding eye contact with him. You must miss them, he said. She paused as she reached him. What? Your family. You said the letter was from them. Oh, the letter. She forgot that she had mentioned it to him. Shrugging, she commented, They're doing fine. Can I read it? The idea of him reading what her family thought of her horrified her. He didn't need reminders that he could have done better. Neil Craftsman did a good job of that already. Well, I... Kind of personal? Yes, she said. You could say that. It was as close to the truth as she wanted to admit. All right. His willingness to accept her answer caused her to be grateful to him. As if there weren't many things she was grateful for when it came to Dave Larson. She passed to the door and waited for him to help her into the wagon, thankful that she lived with him instead of her parents. And that is the end of Chapter 8.